So if you're a pond angler, stay tuned because I've used these 5 baits to catch bass in ponds for years. Ever since I was a little bitty kid to now I'm a little bitty adult. Stay tuned, it's gonna be a good one. My name's Wesley Littlefield and I've got 5 favorite lures that I use in ponds. And if you stay till the end, I'll actually give you 2 bonus baits or lures that will definitely catch you more fish when you're fishing ponds pretty much year round. So let's get started with number 1, the spinnerbait. The spinnerbait just been a super reliable lure for me. I can throw it, I've got a lot of confidence in it, and I know that I'm gonna get bites throwing the spinnerbait. I've thrown it in my farm ponds at my house. I've went to friends' ponds, thrown it there. I've thrown it in neighborhood ponds. I've used it all over. I've even caught fish with it in lakes and strip pits. So the spinnerbait, one of my biggest confidence baits, one of my biggest confidence lures, and I highly recommend you getting a spinnerbait to fish ponds. Now, the key to spinnerbait fishing is actually to adjust your speed depending on what the fish want. Obviously, I mean, that's pretty duh, but sometimes you are gonna wanna burn it. Like in the summertime, or especially early spring, it seems like they key in on it and it's a little better if you're burning it. Where maybe it's getting to be midsummer, late summer, and they're searching for deeper, cooler water, then you might have to slow it down, let it sink to the bottom and reel it near the bottom, slow way down, slower than you think. As long as you feel that blade vibrating, then you're doing something to attract the fish's attention. Now, another thing, running it into cover, running it into structure. So if you've got a brush pile in that pond, or you know there's like a rock pile, or even along the bottom, just running it, starting up that silt, if you don't have any other structure on it, will generate a lot of bites. I can't count how many times I've ran it into a brush pile, popped it through the brush pile, and then thought I was hung up, and come to find out it was just a fish had taken it, and I was fighting it, and I thought I was hung up in the brush pile. Run into stuff with your spinnerbait. It's designed to not get hung up as much, which is one of the reasons why I like it so much in a pond. The next lure is a jig. The good old trusty jig. It's kind of like a spinnerbait, except you know it doesn't have the blades, and that's really the only difference between a jig and a spinnerbait. It's a little less flashy, so you don't draw as much attention, but a lot of times that subtleness is what the fish want and are after, especially in the wintertime like it is right now. I had a couple bites on the jig today. It works, it gets bites in ponds and really anywhere. I don't know how many millions of dollars have been won on a jig in bass fishing tournaments because it just flat out catches fish, and usually it catches big fish. So if you want to catch really big fish, fish a jig. So how to fish a jig in a pond? It's not much different than you would fish it anywhere else, to be honest. I typically cast it out and I let it sink all the way to the bottom. Now it's cold, literally there's ice along the edge of the pond, so I just let it sit there, and I let it sit there and wiggled it a little bit and then let it sit there some more. Eventually I got a bite, but typically during the summer I fish it a little faster. I'm gonna cast it out and I'm gonna reel it a little bit faster, maybe more like a swim jig, or I might actually drag it along the bottom at a little faster pace than I was today. Once again, it's what the bass want. You've got to kind of play with that, adjust it to, you know, what is getting bites at this time. So there's no like one way this is to fish a jig, but literally a jig is probably the best lure of all time, hands down, because you can throw it anywhere. It really doesn't get hung up that much, and bass love it. Number 3 is keeping in trend with these jig looking things and everything, and that's actually a chatterbait or a bladed jig. Now it's literally a jig with a blade on it. It's kind of a mix between a spinnerbait, a crankbait, and a jig. I've caught big fish out of ponds and strip pits with a bladed jig. Absolutely love throwing them because they just catch a lot of fish in ponds. So how do we fish a bladed jig in a pond? Typically ponds don't have the grass that like a lake will have, and they really don't have the rock piles either unless somebody's put them there like I've tried to do in my pond. But that doesn't mean that this lure cannot be effective, because I've caught it in muddy, silty bottom ponds a lot. Specifically my ponds, that's all they are. And that's why I've tried to put brush piles and rock piles in just to give the fish something else to hold on to. All in all, they're still muddy, silty bottom ponds, and this still works. So I know a lot of people say only fish it in grass, or it's the best grass, or whatever. It works in ponds really well, even if they're mud. To fish it though, I typically cast it out and I let it sink all the way to the bottom, and I really like to fish it fast. I like burning it. However, I've caught a lot of fish accidentally because I cast it out, not paying attention, let it sit there, bump it a little bit, start talking, looking to somebody else, do it, you know, paying attention to the birds flying over, whatever it is, and then I got a bite. So it's very effective, casting it out, reel it, pop it a little bit, let it set. Reel it in until you feel it vibrate, let it set. Cold like today, I would cast it out and I would just feel it tink, tink, tink a little bit and then let it set for a while. And then reel it a little bit, maybe even just drag it, feel it vibrate a little bit, let it set. If you do that, you're gonna get bites in a pond with the chatterbait, the bladed jig, whatever you wanna call it. My favorite lure of all time, I've caught a lot of fish, big fish, small fish, just fish and fish and fish on a crankbait. Now, specifically in ponds, I don't go with deep diving crankbaits, the ones with really big bills. I stick with a square bill crankbait like this, and this color works really well. I really like crawdad colors, especially in ponds. So you've got your reds and orangish colors. There's sometimes like a fire craw or fire tiger color. Those work really well in ponds as well. But a shallow diving crankbait is probably like my go-to. Like right when I walk up to the pond, I've probably got a crankbait tied on, to be honest. And then if I'm not getting bites, I'm switching to like a jig, a bladed jig, a spinnerbait, something else. To find fish, I use a crankbait. They're not as good from the bank because of the treble hooks. I've lost a lot of crankbaits while fishing in ponds, getting hung up in brush piles, or you know, getting snagged on something on the bottom, whatever it is, and having to walk around the pond, I can't go out and get it. So be careful with the treble hooks, but it also means you've got more chances to hook the fish. With that said, you still want to run a crankbait into the cover, or you want to be filling the bottom with a crankbait. If you're just running it and not running into anything, more than likely you're not going to get that reaction strike that you need, unless that fish just happens to be right there. But typically what initiates the strike is running into the brush pile, running into a rock, running into whatever, even the bottom, you know, putting it in the mud and dredging it up. Those kind of things are what initiate bites. So if you're not hitting the bottom, if you're not hitting the cover, probably time to switch to something either deeper diving or switch to a different lure altogether. So my final lure, or rig really, that I use when things just get tough and I gotta slow way down, and that's the wacky rig. Now, I love the wacky rig. It looks wacky, it looks weird, but it just works. I've caught a lot of fish using the wacky rig because it forces me to slow way down. I think that's a lot of times what the fish want. They look for a little bit slower moving bait fish or food, forage, and that's what triggers this bite. So on a wacky rig, if you don't know how to rig it, I've actually got a video that I'll leave linked here that'll show you how to rig it. But just a quick rundown, you're gonna run a weightless hook onto your line, hook it through the middle, cast it out, and just let it sink. And as it sinks, it kind of has a fluttering motion and it drives bass nuts. And then once you notice that your line goes slack, pop it back off the bottom, reel up your slack a little bit, and then let it set and settle back down and sink back down to the bottom, and just keep repeating this over and over and over again, and you're gonna catch fish. I guarantee it. Now, because it's got an exposed hook, it's not great to throw in brush piles, but usually that's where the fish are at. So I throw it right as up next to the brush pile and just hope that the fish doesn't get me tangled up pretty much. But it works great around rocks, and as long as you stay on the weed lines or the moss lines of the pond, right on the edge of them, out past them on the edge, that's where the bass will be hanging out. You let it sink right there, and that's typically when you're gonna get a bite. But like I said, the exposed hook doesn't work so great around brush piles, grass, and the nasty pond scum, muck, moss stuff that grows in these ponds. Now, as promised, I've got two other baits or rigs that I absolutely just know will catch me a fish when I need it to. And the first one is a Texas rig. This was probably the first rig that I learned how to rig and how to use. So it's probably the rig that I've caught the most fish on growing up throughout the years. It's a little bit more difficult to rig than the wacky rig, but not really. So I'll leave a video on how to rig it linked right here. I like it more than the wacky rig when I can need to fish it like through a little bit more cover, through a little bit more grass, that kind of stuff, because it's essentially weedless if you rig it properly. So that's why I love the Texas rig, the #1 bait for pond fishing. And I know I'm gonna get booed because it's not cool, but it's using night crawlers, using worms, real live worms. You hook them up, you can throw them on a bobber, you can throw them on the bottom. More than likely, you're not just gonna catch bass. So if you're targeting bass, you're probably gonna catch bluegill, maybe even some catfish if they're in the pond, whatever else is in the pond. I mean, everything eats worms. So if you're just wanting a bite, go get some worms. Now, if you found this content helpful, I would appreciate it if you subscribe down below. That way we can keep bringing you more bass fishing content, and we've got a lot more other planned for our YouTube channel this year. So stay tuned by subscribing. And now that you know what lures work best, you actually need to know how to use them, how to rig them, how to tie them, all that. And I've got a video down below me right now teaching you how to rig and a little bit about how to fish a spinnerbait. It's gonna help you tremendously when you throw a spinnerbait into the pond the next time you go fishing. And until then, I want you to remember that education is important, but fishing is essential.